Hey everyone, welcome to part two of the U.S. Immigration 101 podcast on Andy on Immigration. I'm your host for the podcast. My name's Andy. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. As a quick side note, you can read more about Andy on Immigration by going to www.andyonimmigration.com. There, and you can find more information about us. You can find our blogs and this podcast and other podcasts as we record them going forward, which will also be made available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, all the typical places you find your podcasts. And also, we'll be setting up a YouTube channel. We'll be posting these. And for this Immigration 101, that is a particularly good place to go because the PowerPoint that goes along with this is visually available, and we'll just make this make a lot more sense to you. So, coming along again for the ride this time, we have my producer, Rich, in his home studio in Niagara Falls, New York. And not to be confused, the hat and the shirt are clearly clarifying that we're talking about U.S. immigration, and also that this product is made in the United States and is not subject to any tariffs. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn to our presentation and get us into part two. If you recall, when we last left our hero, we talked a little bit about the goals of U.S. immigration law. We talked a little bit about citizenship. We talked about the numbers of people in the country, and we covered that, over 345 million people or so in the U.S., the vast majority of them are U.S. citizens, either by birth or by naturalization, over 300 million of them. But there was a pretty big number that still remained permanent residents, about 13 million. And as I mentioned, we've historically, over the past 20 years or so, we've been adding about 1 million permanent residents per year. So how do these permanent residents come to be? Well, they come in various categories. There's family-based categories, which basically extend through spouses, parents, children of citizens or lawful permanent residents, and also brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, which is coincidentally, because of the limits on annual immigration, are subject to about a 15 to 20 year wait. Now, at the top of this, it says family-based are 480,000. However, it's important to mention that immediate relatives, who are those persons married to U.S. citizens, parents of U.S. citizens, or children of U.S. citizens, those are children under the age of 21, are immediate relatives, and they're not subject to this 480,000 limit. So the 480,000 limit is for all the other classifications, the citizens or the LPR spouses, the lawful permanent resident spouses, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, all those categories. That's where the 480,000 comes into. In the employment-based categories, now those are permanent residents or green card sponsorships, where a U.S. employer is sponsoring somebody typically for a permanent resident status. There are some categories of employment-based where you can self-sponsor, but broadly, it's still an employment-based petition, and the vast majority of these are U.S. employer-sponsored, not individually sponsored. So about 140,000 are allocated per year, and again, across this category and the family-based category, they're allocated, there's sub-allocations and limits on a per country basis. So what that means is, in practice, for somebody who's a native of India, and those natives of China, those two groups, being the largest countries in the world, are also ones with a high number of demand, particularly in the employment-based categories. So their waits are longer because we only allow certain numbers from each country per year in each of the categories. So, for example, if somebody is here, for example, let's say an Indian national is here in the United States, perhaps now they're working on an H-1B visa, which was very familiar to me back in the days when I was doing immigration law myself. Those persons may have been sponsored by their employer for permanent resident status, and because of these delays and this limit, they may be subject to years of waiting. They may have applied 10 years ago, started their green card process, and they're still waiting. And in one case, I saw a reference in a India Times publication reference that said that based on the flow and the number of cases going per year, it could be 100 years before the allocation ever catches up unless the laws are changed. So, any event, the total is on average is 140,000 per year. The diversity lottery, which is a sort of an odd lottery, which basically says that, and it's been around, I believe, since the 1990s. And the diversity lottery says if we have already countries where we have a lot of high number of permanent residents coming in, we're excluding those by and large, and we're favoring the other countries where we don't have representation. So there's an actual lottery. You put your name and information into a Department of State system, and you apply for the lottery. If you're granted, you can process a green card, and there's some 50,000 of those available per year. Now, some of the other categories that we have for permanent resident status include refugees. That's a number annually set by the president in consultation with Congress. I put a little question mark there because I don't know how much consultation Congress has been giving lately. Um, and anyways, the last full fiscal year that we have information for, there were 125,000 authorized by the president in 2023, and about 59,000 cases were actually processed. In asylees, the actual number in 2023 was 40,000, but there is no official limit on permanent resident grants to asylees. Overall, the total number of actual new permanent residents in the last fiscal year available, where statistics are available, 2023 was 1.17 million. So about 1,170,000 persons in 2023. Um, Now, if we look at all these additions of people into these permanent resident category, um, we have new citizens processed via naturalization, which was from our last Part 1 episode. Those are proceeding at about 750,000 per year annual average from 2010 to 2022. So that's how many people who are advancing once they get to permanent residence status, that's how many are advancing into citizenship. The new permanent resident additions are about 1 million per year over the past 10 years, and that's been pretty consistent for most of the 21st century. Um, Now, just to give you an example of how that breaks down, in 2023, again, the last year that we have data available, family sponsored categories were 756,000. Again, that's more than the 480,000 you saw on the last slide because some of those are immediate relatives, which are exempt from the cap limit. Um, then you have employment categories, which are 197,000 were approved. Again, that's more than the 140,000 you saw on the last slide, and not to get too complicated, but basically there's a flow down where if there's not enough used up in the family, then those can spill down into employment. So some of those spillovers resulted in more than 140,000 employment based cases for green cards being processed. The diversity lottery was 67,000. The refugee category was 60,000, and the asylee status was 40,000 new permanent residents in 2023. Just a quick note on asylees, and we'll kind of come back to this later on, and probably in part 3. The applications that were expected were well above 600,000 in 2024. The number of asylees applying for permanent residence, again, only 40,000 were approved in 2023. So that number of 600,000 far exceeds the annual average of actual grants of permanent residence of some 145,000 over the past 10 years. Um, and just to get an idea of what could be in the pipeline, there's about an estimated 2.5 million asylee cases that are pending at USCIS, that's the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, and in the Immigration Court, which is known as the EOIR, Executive Office for Immigration Review. And there won't be a test on these acronyms. I'm just saying them to impress you as if I know something. No, but really the whole thing is that there's a bunch of these cases out there that could end up, if approved for asylum, could end up being additional applicants for permanent resident status going forward. Now, those are all the permanent aliens in the United States, coming to the United States, that were recently processed. Now let's take a quick look at the temporary legal aliens. Again, these people are here for a specific purpose and for a finite period of time, be it 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years. Let's across the board. So H-1Bs. These are professionals. Most common example that I mentioned before were IT workers, could be engineers. They're in positions that require a bachelor's degree or minimum for entry into the occupation, and they have that degree or its equivalent. Some 85,000 new ones get processed every year under the what I'll just loosely call the regular cap, and I won't get too complicated on this being a 101 session on it. But overall, there's probably about 600,000 total H-1B persons in the United States, because in many cases, each H-1B worker can remain for up to 6 years total. And sometimes they even go beyond 6 years. If they've reached a certain point in their green card process, they may be able to extend their status beyond. So that's why, with only 85,000 per year being granted, that's why we have some 600,000 estimated inside the US right now. Some of the other temporary legal aliens include L1 intracompany transferees. Typically, this is thought of it. It doesn't have to be a big company, but the easiest example is the old school General Motors, plant manager being transferred from the Ontario plant to the Detroit plant. And if that would be an L1 intracompany transferee. It's all within the same structure of one larger entity or multinational company, in that case, General Motors. H2A agricultural workers, they are exactly what they are. They work in agricultural fields, sometimes literally in the fields. And there's an estimated 300,000 in the U.S. at any one time. And that's in addition, this is a lawful category. Well, that's in addition to the perhaps 1 million estimated workers who are undocumented, who also work in agricultural occupations. But the H2A system is the lawful category, and there's about 300,000 in that category. Now, H2B are temporary non-agricultural workers. These are temporarily, usually very temporary, oftentimes seasonal workers, very unskilled type positions. Sometimes a lot of landscapers fill out H2B positions. About 100,000 estimated in the US at any given time. Another category that's kind of been in the news lately, F1 students. There's some 1.1 million estimated F1 students in the US right now. And again, as we've seen recently with F1 students, any of these categories, you're not guaranteed to be here. And if you violate status, if you have some criminal background, you will not be allowed to stay in many cases. Even before that time, just to be clear, most of these categories, for most persons, with a few exceptions, they have to go through a visa process in their home country before they can come to the United States. And as part of that process, there is a background check, which does include a criminal background check. So most of the time, that hurdle's already been cleared before they enter the U.S. So anybody that would be removed, probably in these categories, most likely would be for criminal activity that's taken place since they came to the U.S. or since they initially came to the U.S. Doesn't have to be a U.S.-based crime, but typically in these categories, of course, it would be, since they're already in the U.S., it would be a U.S.-based crime. So again, all these categories, temporary legal aliens here for a finite period for a specific purpose. And in the US, it could be a lowball estimate I gave of about 3 million. But again, it's very difficult to come up with specifics. But if you add up these, you'll see we're getting, we get pretty close to 3 million. And I think it's probably a little bit above that actually in the US at present. Okay, humanitarian aliens. Um, Again, I use this definition of humanitarian. It may not fit the exact category, but I'm using it a little more broadly. Um, and these are basically people here under discretionary basis for a temporary period because of specific set of circumstances or hardship, typically. So we have the DACA kids. That's the deferred action um, kids. This came out of an executive action by President Obama somewhere back around 2012. And basically, what DACA is, and I call the DACA kids, and I'll explain why the kids is in quotes on my PowerPoint presentation. If many children were brought here by their parents, and their parents came in, and their parents were not legal, and the children were not legal. So let's say a 3-year-old was brought across the southern border, and kind of the classic thing that most people probably have in their minds of how our undocumented population arrives here. So they came across with children. They were not lawful. The parents weren't, and neither was the child. That child grew up in the US, probably went to US schools. It's the only country that they functionally really kind of know. And so there was a specific category created that enabled those DACA kids who've been here in the US, were grew up essentially unlawful in undocumented status, and they were giving a status, not really an official status, but it was sort of a discretionary status where they can get employment authorization and they're authorized to live and work and remain in the US. Now, many of those have gone, they're not kids anymore. They're well beyond age 18, but they're still here extending employment authorizations and that sort of things under these very same provisions. And there's an estimated 545,000 of them in the US still. Some of them have moved on to legal status, whether they perhaps were sponsored for permanent residence, whether by a family member or by an employer, or found another avenue to get to a green card status. But there's still 545,000 in the temporary DACA status, I'll call it. Another category that we mentioned during part 1 of Immigration 101 was the temporary protected status, or TPS. And there's an estimated 1.2 million in that category. Some of these are longtime residents. You know, there may have been a natural disaster in Haiti, for example, years ago, and these people are still here after 10, 15 years. So starts at some point to call into question the temporariness of it, but it is, the status is still known as temporary protected status. Then there's a bunch of other special admission categories that were primarily used during the 2022 to 2024 range. We had persons that came out of Afghanistan. Maybe many of them were just plain refugees or had helped the US forces when we were there, some 75,000. Ukrainians, as after Russia invaded a couple years ago, many of them sought protection under US law. We estimate about 190 plus thousand of those people. There was another category for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, or CHNV. It was a special status. It's kind of it's a discretionary. They were paroled into the U.S., not paroled in a sense of criminal parole, but they were just discretionarily authorized to come into the U.S. and they could live here and also obtain employment authorization. Now, recently, the Trump administration has moved to have all these folks removed. We'll see if all that goes through and stays as it gets perhaps battled out in the courts. But that's some 530,000 that they're attempting to remove under that CHNV, special discretionary humanitarian type status. Now, another thing was, if everybody remembers back in 2022, 2023, and 2024, we had a lot of those people streaming across our porous southern border, as it was alleged to be, and there were a lot of admissions. There were a lot of people coming across unlawfully, and this was a surge that occurred after the COVID period of 2020, 2021, and when some of those restrictions started coming off, there was a pent up demand, and a lot of people started coming more, striving to come across the border. So one of the things that the previous administration, the Biden administration, did was it created the CBP One app for use at the southern border. They were basically trying to create a method of identifying people and encouraging them to come through legitimate ports of entry rather than going across the desert. And there were a bunch of people, some 900,000, that probably entered under the CBP One app. Some of them may have been admitted and maybe perhaps made a claim to asylum. Some of them may have been put into proceedings. But in any event, there were some 900,000 or so of them that came and they were discretionary here. Initially, they may be lawfully present here. They may be subject, they may have an asylum claim, so they may be lawfully remaining for that to work through the courts, which are badly backlogged. Um, and some may not. Some may have returned to their home country. Some may have kind of gotten lost into the shadows. But just an idea of kind of the numbers of people that come across in these various categories. All these categories that I talked about, the most recent ones under these humanitarian sort of categories, I classify them in what I call they're legal typically, but they're in limbo. Um, and you have the DACA kids, which are in this discretionary category, but no clear route to permanent residence to stay. Um, the TPS people, same thing, in a very temporary status that typically got renewed every 12, 18, or 24 months by an executive action. And now we're finding out just how not permanent those are, and how that limbo status works when the current administration is withdrawing that and say that's it, we're not extending this temporary protected status anymore. We don't think that the conditions in your home country warrant it anymore. You need to leave. um, Now, the other special admission categories, a lot of those Afghanis that came in, the Ukrainians, those ones are probably going to be eligible to process into permanent residency. But as mentioned, those CHNV, Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelans, they've already been instructed by the administration to leave. Again, we'll see if there's any court proceedings that prevent that from being enacted. And then we have all those other applicants, those persons who came in through the southern border. That's one part of them that came in through the southern border through the CBP1 app. And a lot of those might be in proceedings at this time if they were lawfully allowed to remain pending an outcome. Um, and this all comes at a period in this 2019 to 2024 period where we had some 11 million persons coming in across the southern border. And it's really important to know that, you know, one of the big reasons why so many of them, again, it was the COVID kind of hang up, kind of nobody was coming during that time. And during that time, the law 20 Title 42 was the public health law, which said we can basically summarily exclude or remove these persons when they try to come across or apply for admission to the United States, lawfully or unlawfully. And they use that Title 42 health emergency of COVID to exclude people. And there was a bunch of expulsions as a result of that. Well, when the public health emergency was declared no longer in May 2023, we no longer had that rule in place. So a lot of these other things, like the CBP1 app, the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan discretionary pieces that are above on my slide, those came into play to kind of deal with. There was such an overflow of people that they were trying to lawfully process them and vet them at the border as well. And those were sort of some accommodations that were made for those categories. So bunch of things can happen at the southern border when somebody comes in. In some cases, they can be summarily excluded. Sometimes they're apprehended if they're trying to make their way between ports of entry, and they might be put into deportation proceedings at that point, or they might be brought back across the border. Anybody who's inadmissible at the border may apply for asylum, and they might be put into proceedings. And also, there's another group of unidentified folks who are actually called gotaways. That's not my term. That's the term that the government used. And they estimated some 600,000 of those in 2021, over 600,000 again up into 2023. But once that Title 42 health law ended, so did too a number of the required, those expulsions kind of went down. Um, and so did the number, once those were eliminated, so we weren't summarily keeping people out that way, basically. Also, the number of gotaways reportedly dropped. um, so, and again, that's just an estimate of how folks came in and such like that, but it's a little bit of an explanation. It's very complicated, and I don't want to go too far into it, but I did want to touch it because it's been such a topic in the news for the past few years of what was going on with these people at the southern border. and it was just, there were a lot of admissions. There were a lot of people coming into the country at that time, and all of these different categories that we talk about were some of the different ways that their entries were sort of managed in a very difficult time. So, with that in mind, I'm going to bring on our student, Rich, who was with us. If you didn't meet Rich, Rich is our producer of Andy on Immigration Podcast. And Rich was sitting in as the average Rich, not the average Joe, to just fact check us at the end, as somebody not 100% familiar with immigration stuff, but he is fairly well versed for an average person. But we had him kind of sit along and listen through. He posed some questions in part one of Andy on immigration, our Immigration 101 session. And I see that he didn't drop the course yet, so he's still around for part two. Rich, anything from part two with all the kind of the legal persons, illegal group of aliens from permanent residents into all the alphabet soup of H-1Bs, et cetera, and then on into the other groups who are kind of lawfully here, but in a very temporary status under humanitarian conditions.
Yeah, my question would be like with the temporary status workers and even refugees and stuff. What are the expectations of those folks when they get here? Are they supposed to, are they allowed to be employed? How do they get employed? What do they need? So
Well, if
that
you're,
they can like if you're here on humanitarian purposes,
mhm.
um, how hard is it for them to get a driver's license? How hard is it to get a worker card so that they can, so they are working if they,
Yeah, some of them
so
are, some of them are incident to their status. In other words, just by granting, being granted asylum, you're technically employment authorized. But most of them have to come in. For example, if you came in under the CHNV or TPS, you come in and you have to file an application for an employment authorization, which may take
right,
weeks or months to process. So you get an employment authorization card, and that pretty much you're a free agent in the U.S. employment market. It might be granted for 1 year or 18 months or 2 years, depending on which status you're in. And then you can renew it as long as your status is renewed. But you can use that to go to any employer. And if you were here for immigration part one, 101 part one, we mentioned the Employment Verification Law, IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which all employers have to ask people to complete an I-9 to show their employment eligibility inside the United States.
right,
And most of those people, that would be the document that they would use. For example, if you came here in TPS, you applied for an employment authorization document, or what we call it EAD. And then that's what probably the document that you present to the employer for employment authorization. And you can work for any employer in those types of circumstances. With sponsored categories, for example, if you're an H-1B IT worker, or you were transferred in the General Motors transferee in from Canada, most of those are employer specific. So you have
right,
to, so you can't just go to any employer. You're tied to that employer.
right.
Just same with the H-2B and things like that. Those categories
Well,
predominantly are employer specific.
well, I know, for example, people always say, "Well, I'm moving to Canada." Well, it's not that easy to move to Canada. I know a little bit about this because you can't just say, "I'm moving to Canada." Uh, you have to prove to the Canadian government, at least the way I understand it, that you actually have a job. So
Hmm.
if I was, say, I was lived in Spain and I'm a Spanish citizen and I want to move to the United States because I want to get a job here. I That's just regular immigration. That's not, I have to apply for the green card as opposed to the worker case where they're being sent here by someone they already have as an employer, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you're that Spanish citizen, you might, honestly, one of the ways you might try to do it is by asking an employer to sponsor you into
Right.
one of the status, and then
And then you
figuring
fall
out if
under
you're
that
eligible.
status
Right,
as opposed to just coming in under a green card. Okay. All right.
right.
Those are the
And then that
things that,
employer might sponsor
yeah.
you for a green card. You might get here and
Yep.
fall in love with an American, and that spouse might sponsor you. All
Right.
those sorts of things. I mean, commonly, what we saw in the world of business immigration law that I used to do is many people actually come here and start as F1 students. So a lot of them will come. many of them, the ones that I encountered, may have had a degree, undergraduate degree in China, India, France, wherever. And then some of them, they come here to study in the US on a student visa, get a master's degree. Then they get sponsored by an employer into an H-1B status, for example. And then that employer or another employer might sponsor them for a permanent resident status. And
Okay.
that's kind of a common trail that you would see, at least in the employment world, for how people get here. If you don't, especially if you don't already have a family member, close family member that can sponsor you.
Sounds good. Okay.
Okay, good. Well, that is the end of part two. We took you through the temporary folks, persons temporarily here, and mostly legal groups. And then we're going to head in part three into the undocumented section. So um, look for the next one, part three of Andy on Immigration 101. And also, I would like to remind you that if you have further questions, you can email me at andy@andyonimmigration.com, or you can go to our website to find this and the other podcasts and our other blogs and other information about us at www.andyonimmigration.com. Thanks to Rich for his bearing along with us. He's doing well. He's grading out. I'll give him about a B plus right now. We'll see if he can push it to an A in part three. And we look forward to seeing you in part three, where we talk more about the undocumented population and have a report card on immigration. See you next time.